And we are going to go ahead and jump in. I am going to introduce Tammy Bryant Spratling, who is the CEO of Community Tampa Bay, is going to kick us off today.
Hi, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Tammy Bryant Spratling. I am the Chief Executive Officer of Community Tampa Bay. We are an anti-discrimination nonprofit that organizes ourselves around creating educational spaces for people who are different than each other to communicate across those differences in the pursuit of breaking down prejudice, bias, stereotypes, discrimination, hate, and violence. It's a pleasure to be here with you this afternoon and to lead this conversation off today about the Brown versus Board of Education teaching resource that we have created in partnership with the Tampa Bay Times newspapers in education, with the amazing support and actually editing of Jody Pushkin, who you just heard from, as well as Sue Vedri, who joins us on the call this afternoon. This project has been something that has been in the works for some time now. We've been working with the incredible support of the Florida Humanities. We received a grant to begin this project as a 70th commemoration of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. The 70th anniversary itself will happen next month. So
we wanted to have on this call.
We wanted to have this.
It's for teachers to learn how to teach the history of.
I'm going to go ahead and mute. Okay, there we go. We are creating this resource for teachers to be able to utilize in their classrooms with high school students, and the publication will be able to be electronically accessed as well, and some teachers will receive actually a paper copy of the resource. So we're thrilled to have this as an opportunity to be able to come together and create a foundation for using this teacher resource. And we're so grateful to have you on this call this evening. So before I get into just a little bit of an overview of the Brown versus Board of Education history and decision, I want to also just take a brief moment to talk about Community Tampa Bay. We are an anti-discrimination nonprofit. We do create community conversations in the pursuit of breaking down prejudice and bias and discrimination. And one of our key programs is called the Anytown program. It is a leadership development program that happens over the summer. It is for any high school students 14 to 18 years old. They come together at Eckerd College. The camp is completely free for them to attend. They get to meet youth from across the Tampa Bay area and engage in workshops as well as dialogue around social identity, empowering them to become more inclusive leaders in their schools and in their communities, and to be able to talk more powerfully about their own social identities, as well as connect with people who hold social identities who are different than theirs. So those are coming up this summer. And if you know any youth in your schools that would be interested, please feel free to send them our way. Our website is www.communitytampabay.org, and we would love to see them. We're also always looking for volunteers. It's a volunteer-led program, and teachers make for fantastic volunteers at the Anytown program. So with that, I want to start turning into our topics at hand for the evening. And before we begin to talk about the publication itself and how you can utilize that in the classroom, we thought that we would create a bit of a foundational understanding of the history of Brown v. Board of Education and kind of the legacy of the Brown decision after the Supreme Court made that determination in 1954. So to get us into that space, I'd like for you just for a moment to close your eyes. I'd like you to just take a moment and imagine a Black girl, 7 years old, walking 7 blocks to a bus stop. It's freezing cold. She's shivering, closing up her jacket. Tears are freezing to her cheeks. Halfway down the block, she turns around and she runs, crying up and upset. She runs back to home. She misses the bus that would have taken her over 2 miles across town to her all-Black school. This is the story of Linda Brown. Now imagine a Black mother crying at a kitchen table, distraught that her daughter is missing yet another day of school, all while a perfectly good school is only a few blocks away. This story is the story of Linda Brown's mother. Imagine a Black father holding the hand of his 7-year-old daughter and walking her up the steps of the neighborhood school. They are turned away because of the color of their skin. The principal says that it's the law. This is the story of Reverend Brown, Linda's father. Imagine a young Black high school male student. He's wearing his best suit. He was personally selected to represent his all-Black high school. It is the first day of school, and they drive with his principal across town to the white school to pick up textbooks. These discarded textbooks are books that the white students don't need any longer because they got brand new books. The textbooks that are headed to the Black school have pages missing and ripped out, notations in the margins, including expletives and racial epithets. This is the story of George Knox, now a lawyer and professor in Miami. Imagine a young Black high school female student. She is listening to Reverend James Bevel, a civil rights activist. He's leading a pep rally of sorts at her all-Black high school. He asks if there are any typists in the crowd of students, if you remember typewriters. She proudly raises her hand, reflecting that she is able to use the single typewriter that's in the library because she's a good typist. He asked the students what they would think if they learned that the white high school had rooms full of typewriters. This is the story of Janice Kelsey, who became a teacher and administrator in Birmingham, Alabama. You can open your eyes now. These are the stories and so many more that inspired the journey to Brown versus Board of Education. Once the Civil War was over, little by little, slave owners began to regain power in the South. The promises of equality in the Reconstruction era constitutional amendments were broken, and whites sought to maintain economic power, political power, and social power. As the Supreme Court disassembled the promises of the Reconstruction era amendments, the country saw the rise in Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws were established to maintain racial segregation in almost every aspect of social life. Laws established public restrooms, separate public restrooms, separate rail cars and waiting rooms in public transit, and important for today's discussion, separate schools for Black and white children. In May 1896, the Supreme Court decided the infamous Plessy versus Ferguson case, which established that separate but equal facilities was constitutional. In public education, that meant a system of Black and white schools where no white children could attend Black schools and no Black children could attend white schools, so long as those facilities were equal and their teaching resources were equal and their instruction were equal. However, this led to very unequal conditions in Black and white schools. Black schools were underfunded. They received the discarded textbooks like George Knox received, athletic supplies, and other resources from white schools rather than receiving new supplies. Black schools were fewer and far between, resulting in long commutes like Linda Brown's, over 2 miles across town on a bus. The NAACP, which was established in 1909, played a crucial role in strategically using the legal system to chip away at Jim Crow laws. In the 1930s and the 1940s, the NAACP was gaining traction by desegregating higher education institutions and paving a legal precedent path toward Brown. Using the momentum from success in these college cases, the NAACP began focusing on integrating public schools. By the 1950s, the NAACP brought 5 cases together to challenge racial segregation in schools under the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The courts, which were consolidated under the court cases, which were consolidated under the Brown versus Board of Education title, were heard in 1953 by the Supreme Court. The nature of the other 4 cases was very similar to the story that you heard about Linda Brown earlier. Black parents felt that the day to enroll their children in schools closest to their homes was long overdue. The NAACP legal team, led by Thurgood Marshall, argued that separate schools were inherently unequal and that there was plenty of evidence to prove it. Compellingly and controversially, the legal team introduced sociological reasoning with the doll test. Researchers Dr. Kenneth and Mamie Clark developed the doll test, which placed black and white dolls that looked exactly the same except skin color in front of young children. The study found that Black children consistently chose the white doll as the prettier doll, the nicer doll, the better doll. The case was made that separate schools perpetuated this sense of racial inferiority, and that this, by Dr. Clark's indications, may affect their heads and their hearts in a way that will likely never be undone. The legal team argued that racism created an inferiority complex in Black children, that it hurt their self-esteem and ability to learn and grow effectively in school. Chief Justice Earl Warren delivered the Supreme Court's unanimous decision in the Brown versus Board of Education decision and determined that separate but equal facilities are inherently unequal and that they violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Recognizing the controversial nature of its decision and hardship for implementation, the Supreme Court did not create a plan for desegregation for another year. Then in Brown versus Board of Education 2, or Part 2, the court's usage of the phrase that schools should desegregate with all deliberate speed gave school administrators and state officials legal sanction to delay integration. States went to great lengths to oppose integration, including closing down schools rather than integrating. In Prince Edward County, Virginia, state and local officials closed the entire school system for 5 years rather than be forced to integrate. School administrators skirted desegregation and delayed under resistance measures that they could conjure up for decades. And white parents and community members engaged in fear tactics and violence, like the violence that we saw in Little Rock, as attempts to delay and to circumvent integration. Here in Pinellas County, the schools were not fully integrated until 1971. And actually, Pinellas County was the first school system in Florida to approve a voluntary all-inclusive desegregation plan. So this is just a little bit of a historical overview to set the tone for our conversation about the teaching document and how we can utilize this in our classroom. So at this time, I think I'm turning it over to Roy Kaplan to give us a little bit more context in using this tool and creating community in the classroom.
Good evening, everyone. I hope you can all hear me. I have worked in many of the schools that you're from. I see there's a teacher here from Zephyr Hills High School, and I spent many hours there. I specialize in things that are deemed questionable by the current state administration, but I wanted to go over some things for you that I thought might help you, because I know that there are lots of issues that teachers have to deal with today. And you're being asked to be social workers and psychologists and surrogate parents and nurses and clinicians and all kinds of things. And I know that's an impossibility. And I also sympathize with you because I understand that the children that we work with today come from many different backgrounds and represent a broad diversity of cultures. One of the things that I'm trying to get across today is the need to create a community in your school and in your classroom. And by that, I mean, it's a place where every student feels needed, wanted, and respected. Because if kids don't feel that way, then they're not able to learn what you're trying to teach them. We know that children are really dynamic individuals. They comprehend a lot more than we give them credit for, and consequently, when they're put in situations which really stress them out, then they are unable to learn. And part of this is a problem that I wrote an op-ed piece about a few years ago during the height of the pandemic, and that is childhood poverty in the United States. With the stroke of a pen, the United States government eliminated 50% of the children in poverty. And the thing that I said, isn't that wonderful? But the thing that really bothered me when I thought more about it was they could have done that a lot sooner. Why did they wait for the pandemic to give people families assistance and remove children from the poverty level? The poverty level today in the United States for a non-farm family of four is a little over $31,000. And yet we still have 11 million children living below the poverty level in this country. And we know that 3 million of these children are under the age of 5. And nearly half of the children in poverty, 47% of them, live in severe or extreme poverty. 9 million children are food insecure. They don't know where the next meal is going to come from. Now, when I worked, and I'm retired now, and so I was Tammy Bryant's one of her predecessors, okay? And for many years, I did work in the schools. And I remember one school district, I will go unnamed right now. I was talking with a principal of a high school, a special school. And this principal was telling me how she had to interrupt her conversation because there was a young boy who was in an area that was restricted. She said, "Excuse me, I have to go and talk to him." And she came back after a few minutes after she talked to him, and she said, he didn't belong there. And as we're talking a little more, he was there again. She said, "Let me go down and talk with him." And she came back after about 5 minutes, and I said, "How could he go into that area after you told him it was restricted?" And she said, "Would you believe that the kid has no place to go? I was going to suspend him, but he has no home. He's homeless. He's been living under bridges. And so I didn't have the heart to do that." Well, we know that a number of children are not only food insecure, they don't know where the next meal is going to come from, but they don't have a place to live. I used to show a video in my classes at the University of South Florida that was made of children living in poverty in the Orlando area and living in buses, living in cars, living in motels, and getting up every morning trying to go to school. Brown decision, which is now 70 years old, reflects a change in orientation in our society. We recognize that every kid should have the opportunities to succeed. And what I'm going to try and go through now for you is how you can or may want to create a community so that those children feel like they're needed and wanted in their schools and in your classrooms. Now, I recommend that you do this. You create a dialogue, and you do this every semester at the beginning of every semester. So it's pretty too late for this year, but we're at the end of the year. But the point is, it's never too late to do these things. And what you do is you create a kind of environment where the kids have a chance to sit in a circle. You arrange them in a circle so that everybody is equidistant from the center of the circle. And the children then, and this, I don't care what age they are. You can do the kindergarten kids. Obviously, it's more effective with the older children, but and it's also called restorative justice. It's another term they throw around, people throw around. But the idea is they give every kid a chance to participate, and you don't want them sitting out. Now, they don't have to say something if they don't want to, but this is the idea that every child has something to contribute to the discussion. And in this dialogue, you try to create community. The first thing you do is, you, as I said, you arrange them in, let them arrange themselves. You don't want to do too much for kids, because then they start thinking, what am I doing here? All right, so they move the chairs around, right, and you try and create an opportunity so that everybody is equal or co-equal in the circle, and then you have an opportunity where everybody can contribute to create ground rules. You could call them bylaws or ground rules, or what have you. You try not to give these ground rules to the kids because it's theirs. And so if they can create the ground rules and someone violates a ground rule, you can point to this. That's number 5. No speaking with someone else speaking. You put that up there, not me. So they own it, you see. So when they create the ground rules, it's something that they own. All right. And so ground rules are very important, and you try not to throw them out for them. They may be reticent, but if you let the silence prevail for a few seconds, someone will raise their hand, and you write down the list, or you have a couple students on newsprint write down the list, and then you post them, and they'll come up with things like no speaking when someone else is speaking, and you want things like no foul language, or no put down looks, things, be honest and sincere, confidentiality. That's a tough one too. Confidentiality. What's said here stays here. That's important though. But you also want to get across to the people that are in the dialogue, the people in your room, that people are imperfect, and someone may say something after class. So if something is very important to you that you don't want repeated, don't say it because it could create a problem for you or the class later on. So respect, confidentiality, that's important, but understand that people make mistakes and that we're imperfect. And try to listen and understand one another. I used to do these workshops years ago with James Tokley. Joanna Tokley, his wife, was the head of the Tampa Urban League, and James and I would do diversity training. And he would, when we would get a group of people who didn't want to, they would speak over one another, or they wouldn't pay attention to what had been said. And he said, what we're going to do now? Nobody can talk unless they repeat what the last person said. They summarize what the last person said. You do that a couple times and people start to listen. Well, you can do that with your students too. But you want to get them to understand, try to understand what other people said, to listen. That's something that's missing in our society today. And there's a lot of problems that people have out in society. They say when we have holidays like Thanksgiving or Christmas or Easter, that people are often afraid to go to their relatives' homes because they don't want to get in a dispute with one another. Well, if they practice some of these rules and try to understand what other people are saying and where they're coming from, maybe they would avoid some of the conflict. So people are sitting in a dialogue, they're sitting in a round circle so that everybody is equidistant, and you go around the room and you ask people to, maybe you could do this on the board or you could do it just in the air or what have you. But what you do is something that I call, that I learned to call with the National Conference of Christians and Jews. Now it's Tammy's organization called Community Tampa Bay. It's called a culturegram. And I do this with all my classes, believe it or not, college students. And you ask a series of questions. You let them fill in the blanks. They can write them down on butcher paper or newsprint, or you can just do it and just by way of letting people introduce themselves. And that would be such things as what's your name and your nickname, and how long have you lived here, or what's your ethnic background, and they write down. I would see kids write down white or black. There's no white land. There's no black land. What is your ethnicity? Where do your relatives or ancestors come from? Now, some people may not know. That's okay. If they don't know, they can say, I'm sorry, but I don't know. Now, I've had that happen with a kid with blue eyes and red hair, and her name was Kelly. Maybe it's somewhere in Ireland, but you don't want to put the kids on the spot. You try not to, but I don't let it go when they write down white or black or Hispanic. That's the census term, Hispanic. I'm starting a new book on stereotypes about Latinos. And then there are 4 or 5 different terms used for Latinos. And Latinos are Latinx or Chicano or Hispanic. But one of the things that I know what people prefers to be referred to as their country of origin. What country do you come from? And some African American students might have a problem with this question. And so, okay, it might be, you know what I recommend to my students? Watch Roots Tuesday nights on public broadcasting system, PBS, because it is fascinating to see how they trace people's roots back and people learn about their ancestors. And it's really very instructive. So, it's a great, great program. It's on about 8 o'clock every Tuesday evening, or most Tuesday evenings. And so, people, where were they born? That's a classic question. Where were you born? And what's your favorite ethnic food? Or what's your favorite food? And then these are just icebreakers, ways in which you can loosen them up, or they can loosen themselves up. Okay. The whole idea is to, in addition to just a name or an anonymous face, that there are people behind those faces, and they have needs and wants, and they want to be treated with dignity and respect. They want to be welcome. And if you can create a classroom where people feel they're part of a community, they're less likely to say something or do something to offend their peers. This is very elementary stuff, but it's missing, not just in schools, it's missing in society. Very rarely do we interact with people. I would ask my students at USF to go out and interview 3 people who lived during the civil rights era. That's getting increasingly difficult. That's 1950 to 1970, basically, okay? And what happens is people say, I can't find somebody that old. Well, they can't interview me. I won't let them do that, because then they'll all actually do that, or my wife. But there are people, and some of them are very creative. Sometimes they'll do it online. Sometimes they'll go. I said, why don't you go to a retirement center? Why don't you go to what used to be John Knox Village on Fletcher Avenue? Elderly people love to have interaction with young people, and ask them a bunch of questions about what it was like to live during the civil rights era. Well, the Brown decision was made during the civil rights era. And I remember for the 45th anniversary, I was invited to go to Constitution Hall, where President Bush celebrated that anniversary. It was fascinating because I had been working with the Democratic administration under the Clinton administration, and I looked around and we're sitting way up high, and all the Republicans sitting down low where the president was. But that's okay. I was still there, and I learned something that day, and we celebrated the 45th decision, 45th anniversary of Brown. All right. Now, once you're in your dialogue group and people have had a chance, then you might not be able to accomplish this all in one day. There's nothing wrong with having dialogues on a regular basis, and especially when things come up in schools. That's when I was working at many of the schools that you teach at, when they would bring me in when there was a conflict, and that's why it was sometimes called restorative justice, because you get the people that were involved in the conflict and you let them talk it out. Why was there a fight? What precipitated the fight? What was it, and then you find out that there's some really silly things and the other students say, they look at them, not put down looks, which you said, we don't want those, but are you kidding? You got to fight over that? That kid was suspended already. That kid wasn't here. That never happened. And you find out that lots of times people engage in activities that are unwarranted, and they'll find out that we can work these things out by talking about them. And there are some crucial questions that people really need to consider and may want to ask students. What's it like to be a student at this school? Is there racism here? Are other students racist? Are teachers racist? When you say someone's racist, what does that mean to you? And throw a question out and let the group talk about it for a while. There's no right or wrong answer here, but it's very important to give people a chance to discuss these things so that they feel that they're being respected and that what they have to say is important. And of course, some people may sit there, and at Camp Anytown, and I've conducted many Camp Anytowns over the years, we have a dialogue group every morning, and it's the same group of people, maybe half a dozen people involved in the same group. I don't know if they still do it that way, Tammy, if that's a situation, but we would sit there and maybe 2 or 3 days, a kid would sit there and not say anything. Then all of a sudden they start talking on the third day or the fourth day, and you couldn't stop them. But they were listening. We're not going to pressure people to get into an unfamiliar and uncomfortable situation. And so if a child doesn't want to say something, that's okay. Eventually, something will happen. They may say something or do something to let you know that they've been paying attention, and just because someone doesn't participate doesn't mean they're not listening. You might throw out a question like, what's the greatest problem students have going to school here? How can we make this a better learning institution? What's the issue that concerns you most at your high school or your middle school? Why are there so many fights? Why is it that some kids never get in fights and some kids fight all the time? Well, we know, for example, that some children are much more active than other children. They're called ADHD. I have that problem. My wife says I should be on medication. Well, the fact is that kids that are ADHD listen. They learn, but they may not be able to express themselves the same way as other children. Okay, and one of the things that I think is fascinating, we've had children over the years that worked in various schools and created projects that involved many students in their schools in an effort to try and help students in other schools. For example, one of the questions you could throw out to the dialogue group to create the community would be, what can we do to make this place to improve the life of students in this school? And one of the students that we involved in these kinds of activities years ago came up with an idea of creating a collection of unused food every day at the different schools, and they would pick the food up and redistribute it in the communities so that children could eat and have a normal kind of diet. I for 1 or 2 years worked with the food employees in Pinellas County, and we did once or twice a week diversity training, which is a no-no right now. We might call it something else, diversity, equity, and inclusion. But the whole idea was to get the people there working with students more familiar. And I'll never forget one of the cafeteria workers said, I mentioned something about touching a kid. She said, "You're not allowed to touch a kid." And another cafeteria worker said, "I give them hugs." There's nothing wrong with that. And you have to be careful these days, I know. But the point was that we don't want to be so cold and impersonal that the children don't see us as other human beings that are there to try and help them. So the whole idea is, in creating a community, is to create a place where people feel needed and wanted. So the students are part of it, and they're less likely when they see an individual in their room, in their classroom, or in their school, they're less likely to do something that might offend that person. And I think that if we can do anything in our society today, it would be to create an environment where people feel comfortable talking to one another and viewing one another as human beings with needs and wants, and to be respected so that they are part of our society. Something that's really missing. And I know that this gets into the political realm, and I won't go into that area today, but I want you to know that that's what's missing there as well. That a common sense of appreciating who we are as individuals and knowing that we care for one another and that we're in this together. Because in the final analysis, we all want to be treated with dignity and respect. I'll field questions if you'd like later or now or whenever.
Sorry, I forgot to how to unmute myself.
Okay.
We'll go ahead and wait and take questions at the end unless somebody would like to put something in the chat. That would be great as well. Sue made a really good point in the chat. She mentioned that the dialogue group structure seems like it would work well to discuss some of the questions students will have while studying Brown versus Board of Education. And as we get a little bit more into the curriculum, that's a great point.
Yeah, I have to tell you that I was born in 1944, so I was just 10 years old when the Brown decision came down. But I can tell you that that decision had tremendous impact on society, a tremendous impact, because it overturned Plessy. And basically, he said, "Separate but equal is not equal." And I wonder. I did review the comments made after the recent Supreme Court decision concerning affirmative action in colleges, and I have to tell you that the justices voted against allowing affirmative action to enter into decisions on entrance to colleges and universities, and they used the 14th Amendment to justify their decision, which I thought was a rather perverse kind of thing. But if you really want to look at something, you can go online and Google that Supreme Court decision, and you'll see
Yeah, it's if you belong here.
Katani Brown
Oh,
Jackson's comments about that,
this dude is
showing the
still talking.
disparities in our society. So I would tell you, I would refer you to that. But using a dialogue to cover some of the materials that are in this NIE, a newspaper and education, is a wonderful idea. Get the students involved. Let them talk about what their feelings are. Because I know when Tammy Bryant was talking about the decision and how the schools were integrated, President Eisenhower sent in the what did he do? He nationalized the reserves in and then send in federal troops into Arkansas because people were so opposed to integrating the schools and allowing little black kids go to school with little white kids. Now, one of the things that are pointed out in the NIE handout about Brown, the schools are more segregated today than they were before the Brown decision. And I'll throw that out. I want you to think about this. How can that be? All right, there are reasons for it, but I want you to think about that because that's really important. Schools are more segregated today than they were before the Brown decision. It's a different kind of segregation, though. Different reasons. Okay, I'll stop. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Roy. I'm going to apologize before I start talking because I have cats and they think that when I'm talking to them. So as soon as I started talking, one of my cats decided that she was going to participate in the presentation. So I apologize. I'm not beating them. That's just the noise that she makes. I'm going to share my screen if I can find the little, there it is, and switch to, I have lost my PowerPoints. Let's see. Oh, here it is. Okay. Hopefully you can all see that.
Yes.
This is
yeah.
This is a one of the promotional materials that we're using to advertise the events and the publication that we've produced. Notice that this is going to come up again, and I noticed that there was a question in the chat. Notice that the date is May 17th, 1954, and we're going to come back to that in a little bit. I'm just going to introduce myself real quickly. This is the cat that's yelling at you. This is my email address. So if you have any questions or if you need any more materials, please feel free to email me. Just make sure that you, I'm going to bring it up a couple of times because I know that we have some teachers from out of the area and you might need some assistance. I think that we have some, we definitely have Tampa Bay area teachers, but we also have some teachers from Duval County and from Miami-Dade County. So they are very welcome. And I can tell you a little bit about how you can get our materials if you haven't already gotten them. So basically, I am the manager and curriculum writer for the Tampa Bay Times newspaper and education program. I'm also a teacher. So I know what it's like to have a conversation with your students and have them stare blankly at you and not being able to figure out what it is they're thinking. I'm going to tell you just a little bit about newspaper and education programs first. For those of you not familiar, it is basically a cooperative effort between schools and the local newspaper to promote the use of newspapers as educational resources. Since the 1800s, newspaper and education programs have been around. At the times, we've had a vital program since the 1970s. Which I'm going to say is before my time so that you don't think I was there in the 1970s. Using the newspaper in your classroom and NIE curriculum on a regular basis helps students develop daily reading habits, and it's also a vital link to the real world. As we have found out with the last two publications that we have, actually the last three publications that we have created, a lot of times students see history no matter how recent it is to us, it's ancient to them. So the idea of being able to connect them to what's going on in the world today and being able to connect them to primary sources and secondary sources that they can relate to is very imperative. Research shows that students using the newspaper as an educational resource score more highly on standardized tests, develop the habit of lifelong reading, and are more likely to become engaged citizens and regular voters. It's important to get them to be engaged. As Dr. Kaplan said, it is important to have them engaged in your classroom as well as in the, as they would say, IRL. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about informational text. Most of you know what informational text is. Basically, its primary purpose is to inform the reader about the natural or social world. Informational text, there we go. Employs a variety of structures to assist the reader in finding information quickly and efficiently. So in this publication that we have produced, we have articles, we have images, we have photographs. We also have some supplemental materials that include essays and cartoons that we're going to talk about. All of these are informational texts, and all of them are appropriate for your language arts and or social studies classrooms. It's important to remember that the newspaper is both a primary and a secondary source. Primary sources are the raw materials of history, original documents and objects that were created at the time under study. So when you're talking about the amendments, obviously going directly to the amendments is a great idea. The publication that we're going to talk about uses people stories from the perspective of those that lived through the time period. Secondary sources are accounts that retell, analyze, or interpret events, usually at a distance of time and place. And again, these are both excellent. Sorry, I can't do two things at once. These are both excellent sources for the BEST standards and for the Florida standards for social studies. Oops, there we go. For those of you in the Tampa Bay area, if you are not familiar with our newspaper and education program, you can sign up to get free access to newspapers, either in print or the digital edition. If you are outside of the area, then if you email me, I will get you access to the Tampa Bay Times. We also have on our statewide FPES website, we have a list of newspapers that you can contact. But if you're looking for help, please feel free to email me and I will direct you to the newspaper in your area. And again, we can direct you to have access to the Tampa Bay Times. Okay, so before we talk a little bit about Brown versus Board of Education, I have a little video for you to watch. Let's see if I can do this without creating too much. Let's see.
Many communities are struggling with the complex, highly emotional problem of busing.
In 1971, Charlotte, North Carolina opened the door for busing across the country, forcing the nation to confront a history of old prejudices, well-honed politics.
I'm against busing. That's forced integration.
And long-held fears of change.
It's not integration, it's communism!
Charlotte overcame these hurdles, becoming a national symbol of what was possible.
On the whole, integration has gone more smoothly here and has been more successful than many people imagined.
But decades later, the story of Charlotte's integration has taken a decidedly different turn. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that schools divided along racial lines were inherently unequal. But over the next decade, only about 1% of blacks in the South ended up attending integrated schools. Arthur Griffin was among the students affected by the slow pace of change.
My elementary schooling was all black. There was a morning session from 8 to 12, and there was an afternoon session from 12 to 4 because it was overcrowded. We had those two shifts. My high school was all black. We had old books, we had old football uniforms, and had old band uniforms. This went on for years.
This inequality in Charlotte led to a federal lawsuit. When the Supreme Court ruling finally came in 1971, the effects rippled across the country.
A unanimous Supreme Court today affirmed the principle of busing school children to desegregate schools. In fact, the court said almost anything was all right if it served this purpose.
The effects of this decision are almost incalculable.
How many are going to keep their children home? Home, not on a bus, nowhere but home.
Charlotte's desegregation program had already been set in motion by a federal judge a year and a half before.
The people of this community will not accept nor comply with these oppressive orders.
What happens if the school board should bring legal action against you for keeping him home?
I guess I'll get free board and meals.
To keep whites in the school district, most of the students who were bused were black. The students sent to West Charlotte High, the pride of the black community, were an exception.
Immediately when the decision was made that white kids would now be bused into West Charlotte, it was like a community joke. Like overnight, the gravel parking lot was paved. The athletic facilities in terms of the football stadium, basketball, gymnasium stuff was upgraded. It was like overnight someone had written a check for $1 million.
That first year was not an easy one, as black and white students found themselves under a microscope walking down halls with other races for the first time.
I had come from this lily white neighborhood, and I never knew that there was so much color.
West Charlotte High School used to be all black, and during that first year there was racial fighting and boycotts by some whites.
Students were injured during some of the incidents as tension between black and white students grew.
It had always been a black school, and they had very much pride, which I understand. You know, they were proud of their football team and proud of their cheerleaders and proud of their majorettes. Because I was a majorette, I had 5 girls jump me one day. It was very unsettling. I didn't realize that there were good things to come. It was just going to take time.
It has been 3 years since the Supreme Court handed down its historic decision, requiring extensive crosstown busing of students in the Charlotte-Mecklenburg school system. In fact, attendance for the first day was near a record for the public schools.
I don't think the parents adjusted to the integration as quickly as the kids did, because we were down in the trenches dealing with each other day to day. If you look at it as a battle being fought, we were the ones that were actually the soldiers, and we were on the front line.
The example set at West Charlotte High School turned it into a darling of the national media.
4 students from Boston schools plagued by a busing controversy were in class in Charlotte, North Carolina today.
Students have been promoting school spirit and togetherness.
And while desegregation hasn't worked perfectly in Charlotte, it has worked.
We were thrown together at first, but we've learned to adjust to each other, and we all get along a whole lot better.
I think busing was a tremendous success. The fact that my children and my neighbors' children, even to this day, are friends. And as you can see, I'm African American. My neighbors' children were white.
I don't know how you could have changed anything if it had not been for busing.
In the decades since Charlotte's integration, the debate has raged over the long-term effect of busing. Researchers like Professor Rosalind Mickelson have sought to answer that question through her analysis of a massive database of studies at the University of North Carolina.
Children who attended diverse schools scored better on tests. They were more likely to graduate, to avoid crime. They're more likely to go to college, graduate from college. There is growing evidence that white middle-class children and middle-class children from all ethnic and racial backgrounds also benefit academically and socially from going to integrated schools.
Good evening. We're going to begin this evening with the most deeply vexing issue in the history of America.
In 1999, a new generation began to confront the legacy of busing, and the TV cameras turned again to Charlotte. In response to a lawsuit, a federal judge said that the district's busing program had been a success, but his ruling didn't stop there.
Federal Judge Robert Potter essentially said the district had met its constitutional duty by successfully creating a single school system serving all children regardless of race, and he said that no more need be done.
It's going to now be the quality of education being prioritized over the racial quotas.
The parents who had brought the suit were white, some of them transplants from other cities where busing hadn't been done. But some black residents also had reservations. Academics had improved, but not always as much as parents had hoped. And as the city spread out, many grew tired of the logistical pretzel that busing had become. Charlotte wasn't alone. A series of Supreme Court decisions in the 1990s led to hundreds of desegregation orders and plans being dismantled across the country.
School districts are asking other courts for permission to go back to the old neighborhood school system.
We need to get school officials out of the business of racial engineering and into the business of providing an adequate education for all students.
Our babies need our parents. They need that ownership. They need to know that mom, dad, uncle, and grandma are just a step away.
Arthur Griffin was against Charlotte's decision to stop mandatory busing.
I just decided not to run for school board anymore, simply because I was out of step. So rather than obstructing the course of events, I said, I'll just step aside and I won't try to stop you, and we'll see what happens. And it took a year or two or three before West Charlotte actually got to the point that it is today.
In the 1970s, West Charlotte was a national model for school integration, 40% black, 60% white. Today, it's 88% black, 1% white.
I think you saw some white flight and some bright flight.
I'm sorry, say it again. What kind of flight?
White flight and bright flight, where the black middle class folks were leaving too.
It wasn't an instant death, but you allowed great teachers to leave. You allowed great numbers of students with great needs to bubble up to West Charlotte, and the resources were not there to help those kids be successful.
Another benefit of busing, mixing students of different income levels and social classes, has also been dismantled. Like most school systems, West Charlotte today has more Hispanic and Asian American students, but the student body remains economically disadvantaged. A recent report warned the growth of racial and economic segregation in today's schools is placing the promise of Brown at grave risk.
We basically have two systems going on right now, one for the haves and one for the have-nots. We are a lot more segregated, both racially and economically, than I think anyone would have imagined would occur.
Thank you, Tammy. Okay, so the publication that we did focused on Florida, but as you can see, this has been a national issue. And one of the things that I wanted to bring up after this video was that there has been recent reports saying the same thing about Florida schools, that Florida schools are more segregated now than they were before. There's a report from the Collins Institute that we quote in the publication talking about that very issue. So I'm going to go back to sharing screen. Let's see if I can do this time without messing up here. Dun, dun, dun. There we go. Okay. Can you all see that? Sue, am I good? Okay. So this is the cover of the Separate But Not Equal publication that we've been alluding to. And I'm going to tell you that there are a couple of different ways that you can find this publication. One is, depending on your school, depending on your high school, this has either been sent to your school or it is available to you on a PDF. There's also a teacher guide and there's also additional interviews. So I'm going to switch. Let's try that. Okay, can you all see our website? Or is it just showing the PowerPoint? It's showing the PowerPoint. Okay, I'm going to switch. Hold on. Don't go anywhere. Okay, this is our website. When you go on the top, there's a bunch of tabs here. If you go to curriculum and you go down to social studies, and then you go, these are all in alphabetical order. If you click on separate, but if you look at separate but not equal, you will see all the links down here. And the reason that I'm bringing instead of taking you directly to the publication, I'm letting you know about the other links because unfortunately, this publication is only 16 pages long. And therefore, we have half the interviews are in the publication and half the interviews are actually posted on our website under additional interviews, which I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. So now I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint. Which I have, there we go. I'll get the hang of this eventually. Okay, so I also want to point out to you the Florida standards. So a lot of times teachers have been asking, they're a little confused as to what can be taught and what cannot be taught. So I'm here to tell you that everything that is in this publication is being correlated to the Florida State standards. They're either American history standards, African American history standards, or best standards. So this is all published in the publication, and there's also standards, as I'm going to show you after all of the activities, so you know where to plug that in if you have to plug it into your lesson plans. So one of the things I want to mention that we talked about with informational text is the idea that we have different kinds of forms. In this case, we have a headline, we have an article, and then we have a photo. The photo also has a caption under it, which describes what's going on. But what you can do is you can ask your student to evaluate the photo. This is actually a photo of the first school in Florida that was integrated. This is in 1959 in Miami-Dade County, and it was actually integrated by accident. So this is an interesting story. You can have your students do research on this, or you can just have them kind of focus on this particular issue. And one of the things I want to bring up again is the timeline. We talked about this is 1959, the desegregation of schools was supposed to happen in 1954. So we have a timeline in the publication that goes all the way from 1866 to 2023, talking about different events that happened, starting with the Civil Rights Act in 1866 and culminating with the decision to expand school choice, which we're going to also talk about in a minute. When you have your students reading these articles, you're going to ask them to examine the articles in two different ways. One way is to looking at what evidence is being provided in the article, what claims are being made, and asking them to create an argument. Another way is to break down the articles. I keep having to move my people. Another way of examining the articles is to have the students read, think, speak, research, and then write about it. One thing I want to point out is the writing about it does not have to be a research paper. One of the things I like to promote with my students, and one of the things that I've noticed helps them out, is if you let them journal. And if you let them give their impressions of things that maybe just you're seeing at first, so that they're not necessarily broadcasting it to everyone, they might be a little bit more honest with their impressions. This is, of course, a picture of Linda Brown when she was 9 years old. She, although they won the lawsuit, Linda Brown never got to go to the school because she graduated before the law was passed. One of the other things that we focus on in this publication is Florida. And here we have some Florida change makers in what we call our center spread, which is pages 8 and 9. We have Mary McLeod Bethune, Leroy Collins, Reverend A. Leon Lowry, Harry T. Moore, James B. Sanderlin, Robert Sandals, and Robert Saunders and Virgil Hawkins. And these are just a few of the many people that were involved in making change in the state of Florida. We also have an activity here talking about leadership in the news, and it mentions some other great people: Charles Hamilton Houston, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. There's a whole list that you can see, that you can have your students research and then share what they learned with their classmates. So if you broke your class up into groups and you had one group research Charles Hamilton Houston and find out who he is and why he's so important in the fight for against Jim Crow laws and for desegregation of schools, and then they can present that to the class so that not everybody has to do the research, but everybody gets the benefit of it. Can't tell if I'm talking too fast or too slow. So one of the main things we did in this publication is we interviewed local, and by local, I mean Florida people who were alive during the during segregation and during integration timeframe. This is Henry Washington. And Henry Washington, who is a member of the Hillsborough County School Board, grew up in Hillsborough County. He attended a school named Middleton High School in the 1960s, which was the one of the 3 all-black schools in the area. And he tells his story about what it was like to go through that, to have his school closed down when they decided in 1971 they were going to close most of the Black schools in the Tampa Bay area. He talks about the same thing that you just heard on the video, the idea that he was in sports and he got hand-me-down uniforms. This is a picture of one of the books. As was mentioned earlier, the books often had pages torn out of them. There were derogatory racial slurs written in them. There were kids' names written in them. Same thing with the desks that the students got in the schools. And this is his story talking about that time period. I also interviewed Chloe Coney, who is also from the Hillsborough County area. She is a force to be reckoned with, and she is one of the speakers that's going to be speaking at our event on, correct me if I'm wrong, April 23rd. Is that correct, in St. Petersburg? One of the things that's interesting about her is she chose to go to an all-white school in middle school so that she could integrate it. Her parents were a little scared for her, but she decided that it was something she wanted to do because she was influenced by President Kennedy. If you remember, President Kennedy said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country." And she got to see him when he came to Tampa on November 18th in 1963, which of course was 4 days before he was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. So she talks a little bit about that. She talks a little bit about all the students lining up on the side of what was then Grand Central Boulevard to wave to the president and see the president. And she talks about why she thought it was important for her to make the decision to help integrate the schools. Another person I interviewed was a teacher in Pinellas County Schools. She was at Boca Ciega High School when they first started integrating in 1971. And she talks a little bit about what that was like to be on double sessions because they had too many students and they couldn't have them all at the same time. So they had the Black students, the undergraduate is not the right word. Freshman and sophomore students in the mornings and the junior and senior students in the later on in the day. And she talked about how it was traumatic for the students, not only because they were on double sessions, but because they were thrown into a situation that they were not familiar with. And we're going to talk a little bit about this picture in a minute. Juanita Cook went to all Black schools up in Leon County. She also talks about her school being closed and what they lost by that happening. Today you would think, well, why is that a big deal? She still got to go to school, but all of the things that were important to them in their schools were taken away from them. Their school mascot, the school buildings. A lot of times, the school she went to, Lincoln High School, the school was destroyed and they rebuilt it, but they didn't take any of the old things that were for nostalgic purposes in the school. Mark Saunders has an interesting story because he grew up in St. Augustine, and his school, instead of just completely integrating, they had a white school and a Black school, and they bused the students for different times of the day. So the students would all go to the white students would come to the Black students for one class, and then they would go back to the white school for another class. He said that it appeared to be integrated, but they also had two different principals. And he said it was clear that one principal was more superior than the other principal because he had to ask permission to do things. So I have his story in here too. He talks a little bit about, believe it or not, in the 1970s, early 1970s, they had bomb threats at the schools. And he talks a little bit about that. Ida Booth is also from Hillsborough County. She was another student who was rezoned to go to an all-white school. She talks a little bit about what happened to her when she was elected student council president, and then they closed her school. So she couldn't serve as student council president. She had to go to a new school. And she said that that was very traumatic for her. She loves school, so she didn't let it affect her. But again, the idea that students didn't know that their schools were going to be closed until 1971, until the year it actually happened in Pinellas and Hillsborough counties, was very traumatic for a lot of the students. We also have a lot of newspaper activities. I'm going to move this out of my way. I'm going to talk a little bit about this newspaper audit one first. As you'll notice, this one has a few more best standards, and the one next to it, the Freedom Riders one, has a little more social studies standards. Depending on what you're teaching and what grade level you're teaching, you can again fit this information into your lesson plans. The newspaper audit is basically asking students to go through the newspaper and look to see how different types of people are being presented. One of the things we talked about a little bit earlier was not to have students necessarily writing long reports on this stuff, but in this case, they're creating an infographic. And in the Freedom Riders one, they are actually writing an essay. We're talking about they're talking about Plessy versus Ferguson, talking about the Freedom Riders, and then making the connection between Brown versus Board of Education, which, as Tammy mentioned, was the catalyst for most of the things that happened in the civil rights movement. We also have a lot of local photos in the publication. One of the things that you can talk to your students about is why photos are a good way to document history. What are some of the drawbacks of photos? What are some of the positives? What's going on in the picture? What makes them think what's going on in the picture and what kind of details do they see. One of the things that I've noticed with my students is they love to look at photos more than they love to read the written word. So Snapchat and Instagram, and I'm missing one, TikTok are great sources of them for getting their news, which is why I'm encouraging you to sign up to get the newspaper in your classroom. And one of the things to remember is when you look at photos, you don't see anything that's going on in the side view. You don't know what happened before, you don't know what happened after, and you're just looking at one specific scene. So it's important to remind students of that. And it's important in this day and age to remind students that not all photos are created equal. Some photos are not as realistic as they appear. This is Dobie Elementary School. This is a school in Hillsborough County for Black children that they were told was equal to the elementary schools for white students. One of the things your students is going to notice is how badly in repair the school needs to be, as well as something is missing from it, air conditioning. There's no air conditioning in these schools. And of course, as you can see, there's a lot of area here for when it rains, students trudging through the mud and that sort of thing. Another photo that I pulled for you is this photo that we just saw under Jan Atkins' interview. This is a fight that was happening at Boca Ciega High School. One of the reasons that I'm bringing this to your attention is to let you know that the articles that we wrote about the people who lived this during this time period, we also looked for photos that corresponded to their stories, and we looked for newspaper articles that corresponded to their stories so that we have things that back it up. It's not just somebody telling their story and we're not sure if it's true or not. We also have the information. We have primary sources like photographs and newspaper articles to back those up. This is another example this is the St. Petersburg Police Tactical Squad that is at Lakewood High School during the 1970s when they were trying to integrate. There's a lot of newspaper articles that students can look for in the archives to see that this was kind of an everyday occurrence that was happening. In our supplemental interview section, and I have to stop sharing, reshare, go back to the website. And I'm going to click on the additional interviews. Are you all seeing that? The table of contents. We have 6 more interviews of people to add to the collection that is in the publication. So I talked to John Avery, Bobby Bowden, Randall Gainforth, Charles Fred Hearns, Dr. Roselia Kennedy, Noreen Miller. They all have great stories and they all have very different experiences, even though some of them grew up in the same areas. Fred Hearns and Henry Washington both grew up in the same area, went to 2 different schools and have 2 totally different experiences. Sorry, I have to stop sharing and go back to the other screen. I'm getting a little better at this. This is a quote from Dr. Roselia Kennedy. And this is in her story, and I found it was fascinating to listen to her talk about this. She was one of 3 Black students that attended King High School in Hillsborough County. And she said one of the most memorable experiences she had was lunchtime. So on the first day of school, she went into the lunchroom. It was very crowded. There were lots of people there. She didn't know where to go. She finally found a spot at the end of the table. She put her books down and everybody at the table got up and walked away. Can you imagine being a child and having everybody walk away from you? She said the teachers didn't do anything. They just kind of peered around the corner to see what it was that she was going to do. And she said she didn't do anything. It took until Thanksgiving before another student, a white student, finally talked to her. And Dr. Kennedy's reaction to the white student talking to her was fear for that white student. She was afraid she would get in trouble for talking to her in the lunchroom because she knew, because Dr. Kennedy's brother was one of the Freedom Riders, and she knew that they would also get beat up if they thought that they were promoting integration of white and Black students. This is a quote from Bobby Bowden, who was talking about busing, which we just talked about. One of the things that also was, one of the things that I found really interesting in my conversation with him was, you don't really think about the turmoil that busing has for lunchtime and after school programs and before school programs. So students were bused in from new neighborhoods. They were forced to be friends with people that didn't live near them. They didn't go to the same churches. They didn't play on the same teams. They didn't drink out of the same water fountains. And they were forced to go to these new places, and they couldn't participate in clubs or after school opportunities because they had no way to get home. If they weren't able to catch the bus, their parents weren't able to come pick them up. So again, put yourself in the position, and one of the things we talk about with building communities is have your students put themselves in the position. Tammy asked you earlier to close your eyes and imagine being that student. Your students can relate to their schools being closed because of COVID. They can relate to being things changing, but they might not be able to relate to this kind of trauma or this kind of turmoil, but they do have they're all kids. So they do have something in common with some of these young people. These are some newspaper headlines that I'm just going to kind of go through really quickly because there's something really important I wanted to talk about relating to one of them. So as you can see, this one has South cedes under Supreme Court edict. And then, of course, we have ruling invalidating school segregation raises grave issues. There's another article where we're talking about the segregation problem. This was in the Fort Lauderdale Daily News. This is from the Fort Myers News Press. Again, we have one major headline, and then we have other things that are going on talking about it. We also have a time frame here. Presidential order halts Army McCarthy hearings. So that's another way to get your students to know what was going on in history during that time. It wasn't just segregation, but there were other things happening. This is the Orlando Evening Star. Notice the date is May 17th, 1954. And we have the High Court outlaws school segregation in big, huge letters. And then on the side, it says no action set until fall. So the Supreme Court has made a decision, but we're not going to really do anything about it yet. We're going to wait and see what happens. Tallahassee Democrat, same thing, court bans segregations in public school cases. Bradenton Herald, Miami Daily News. And then I'm going to focus on these next three articles for a reason. The date on this article is May 1954, and it says Supreme Court rules racial segregation in public schools is unconstitutional. And that is from the St. Petersburg Times. So we're talking about stopping segregation, 1954, end of segregation. This article talks about the integration plan is finally approved for Pinellas County, and the date on this article is July 24th, 1971. That's a long time from 1954. And then when we go to this last article, we're talking about ending busing in August 2000. So this is why the newspaper articles are important, to show kind of not just that there's a timeline, but that the timeline moved slowly. When the second law was passed, when Brown 2 was passed, they did say that it was supposed to happen with deliberate speed. And as we can see, this definitely didn't happen with deliberate speed. And when we look at some of the newspaper articles, when we talk about the violence in Hillsborough schools, and you can see that there's papers thrown all over the place. We have Boca Ciega under heavy guard. One of the people I talked to, I believe it was Randall Gainforth, talked about in his school, and I forget what county he was in, he said that the police presence made things worse, that the fact that there were police guards, armed police standing at the entryways to the school made things worse for the students. And they actually got rid of the police. One of the things the students suggested was getting rid of the police. Here's another thing that is an interesting correlation to today's time period. And this was the idea that when they closed schools, they either closed the Black schools or they closed all of the schools in the area, and white parents decided that instead of integrating, they were going to send their students to private schools. And of course, we know now that school choice is a big deal and that we have school vouchers and that parents can still do that if they want to. It's not necessarily for the same reasons. The reason that schools are segregated today is more economic, but if you look at what happened in the 1970s and you're looking at what happens today, a lot of that is runs parallel. One of the other things that we like to put in our teacher guides are analyzing cartoons, and we have a couple of worksheets for you in the teacher guide that I am going to just show you real quick. And here are some cartoons. This is a traditional Black school showing that it's dilapidated. This is one showing Thurgood Marshall and his speedy train that the NAACP is going to, with deliberate speed, integrate the schools. This one's a little hard to see, but we have two African-American children running away from a crowd of white people who want them off the property. So there's a bunch of cartoons in the teacher guide that you can have your students interpret. I don't know if anybody is teaching adult learners that's here tonight. I know that the GED always has some sort of interpreting political cartoons on it. So it's a good idea to get students to understand what political cartoons are and how to interpret them. I'm going to go back to that one just for a second. I'm going to switch back to the website. Let's see if I can do that without breaking anything. Oops, I lost my Zoom window. Let's try that again. Oh no, I have my Zoom window, but I don't have my share screen. There it is. There we go. Okay, so when you go to our curriculum page, and again, I'm going to show you how I did that. Actually, while I'm here, if you are a Tampa Bay area teacher, to sign up for the Tampa Bay Times, all you have to do is click sign up here. If you're in another county, again, you can email me, and I'm going to show you my email address again later. But you go to social studies, go down here, click here to download the publication, and here's what the publication looks like. Can you all see the publication? Yes, okay, thank you. This is a 16-page publication. We have some call-out quotes for you. We have lots of photos from all over Florida, different newspapers. Here's the Key West Citizen and the Fort Lauderdale Daily News. I mentioned Linda Brown earlier. This is a close-up of the inside of the school that we taught. Oh, I'm sorry. This is the Glover School, not the Dobbyville School. Sorry about that. We also have a timeline that's running along the bottom. Some did you know pull out facts for your students. This was a spaghetti desegregation plans. You know how we see spaghetti hurricane plans? Pretty much they did the same thing when they were trying to desegregate the schools. Here's an example of the Freedom Rider, one of the Freedom Riders buses. This is what I referred to as the center spread. And again, the activities that the students are doing, the standards are all listed at the end. The standards are also listed on the back page, which I am going to get to. The standards that I showed you on the PowerPoint are also listed on the back page. We have some quotes sprinkled throughout, little information about us. A big shout out to Florida Humanities for funding this project, and to Community Tampa Bay for all of their wonderful help that they have given us. We also had some project scholars that went over the material for us, and that information is listed on the back page as well. So now I am going to go back to my PowerPoint and, oops, let's try that again. There we go. And I'm going to go again to my contact information so that you can write it down if you need it. My email address is jpushkin@tampabay.com. That is the easiest way to get a hold of me, especially if you need more copies of the publication, or if you need any assistance with any kind of teaching. I'm going to open it up for questions, but before I do that, I'm going to leave this here because Sue will yell at me if I don't. We have a Survey Monkey for you as a survey for this webinar to let us know your thoughts about it. I think, Sue, can you, oops, I didn't mean to do that. Sue, can you put that in the chat? Can you put the link in the chat for me? That would be
I sure can. And I also, I don't know if you can, Jody, but it would be nice. I don't think that you showed the teacher guide, and I just want people to know how many extra things are available through the teacher guide.
I will do that. Do you need me to leave this up while you're typing?
Yes, please.
Sorry. My brain's a little slow today.
Jody, you can go ahead and show the teacher guide while I'm.
Okay, great.
Yeah, sorry.
I am going to go back to share screen. I am going to go back to the website. And I'm going to pull up the teacher guide. The teacher guide is right under the publication. And the table of contents, which Sue put together for me because she is awesome and I do not know how to do a table of contents, is going to show you how much great stuff we have in here. We have a listing of the Florida standards, which I'm going to mention one more thing about in a second, how you can request newspapers, and the activities, as you can see, go from page 13 to page 41. So I'm going to scroll through a little bit, but I want you to see, a lot of times people are saying, well, this isn't something we're supposed to be teaching in class. You are supposed to be teaching this in class. Look at all of these standards. These are all standards that relate to not only African American history, but American history itself. So all of these pages are important for you if you need to put these in your lesson plans to explain why you're teaching this. And then I'm just going to kind of scroll through a little bit on the activities. We also have all the standards listed underneath them. We have some of the basics from vocabulary to here's the report that I talked about, the Leroy Collins Institute report titled Patterns of Resegregation in Florida Schools. The links to the report are there. As we go along, there's some discussion questions for your students. There's also some links for you to, not that one, but there's some links to Library of Congress sites. There's some links to, I want to make sure I'm saying it right. Is it Learning for Justice now? Learning for Justice, which used to be Teaching Tolerance, Facing History and Ourselves. We talked a little bit about the primary sources. Here's an article titled Latinos in the 14th Amendment. So there's a lot of information in this teacher guide for you, and this is available for you to just download off our website, and there's no charge for you. Now I will open it up to questions. Did we have any questions in the chat? Let's see.
I think that there were a couple people in the chat who were looking for some additional clarification on the timeline. In other words, if Brown v. Board was decided in 1954, why is it that busing just started in 1971? And Tammy this might be a Tammy question. Do you want to address that briefly, Tammy?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So across the South, there were efforts to delay integration. Lots of parents, white parents, wanted to maintain the status quo, and so communities were kind of uprising and creating strategies to delay integration, and then actually states. So there's the Southern Manifesto that was a written document by senators from across the southern United States, essentially saying that school districts should completely throw the Brown versus Board of Education decision out the window and not implement it. Finding that it was unconstitutional in itself to have been a decision of the Supreme Court, and so. Efforts across the United States caused tremendous delay for decades for true integration to occur.
Thank you so much. And I know that I know, and Jody, this might be for you, but I think there was also some confusion regarding the fact that all 67 counties in Florida were segregated when the ruling came down, and they all integrated at different paces and with different varying degrees of speed and success. So for example, in Hillsborough County, the Black schools were closed.
Yes.
But in Pinellas County, right across Tampa Bay, that did not happen, and students were bussed in between. And other counties in Florida were different. And you talked to people from a lot of different counties.
Yeah, the one picture I showed you that we have at the beginning of the publication showing in Liberty, Florida, the one school that was integrated in 1959 was actually integrated by accident, because apparently it was an interracial couple, and when the one parent came to register the students, they didn't realize that the students were Black. So it's interesting that that was one of the first, and that happened in 1959. And like I said, that was in Miami-Dade County. And then the rest of them in Pinellas County, I know that there were a lot of protests against closing the Black schools. And in Hillsborough County, well, one of the reasons they closed the Black schools is because they couldn't get the white parents to send their children to the Black schools. So they first integrated middle schools and elementary schools with a few students. They asked for volunteers, and then they just decided, because the law was telling them, you either do this or you get no more money, they decided that it was time to close the schools.
So you're saying they closed the Black schools because they weren't going to get money if they didn't integrate. So
Correct.
they bused the Black students to the white schools?
Yes. And I believe that, Tammy, do you know, did they also bus white students to Black schools in some areas?
Yes. They were busing white students to Black schools and Black students to white schools.
Yes.
And one thing that might surprise some of your students is that those busing orders, and again, this varies a little bit throughout Florida, but busing orders were not lifted until the 2000s. so counties were not judged to have fulfilled the requirements of desegregation until the 2000s. Resegregation of schools is a whole nother topic that's beyond the scope, unfortunately, of this webinar, but is something that I think some more advanced high school social studies students would really benefit from doing some research on.
And we have a couple of activities in the teacher guide that focus on that, but not a lot because, like Sue said, it's kind of beyond the scope. One of the questions I see here is about the resources. I'm not quite sure I understand the question. Do the resources you shared include student newspaper sources?
Yeah, the question is, are there any student newspaper resources included in the packet that you've created?
If you mean like student newspapers as in like a high school newspaper, no, we don't have those.
And we don't have a separate newspaper for students. It's the regular newspaper. So if you are going to use the activities with the newspaper, it would be the regular newspaper. If you are, well, whether you're in the Tampa Bay area or not in the Tampa Bay area, you can certainly combine, compare and contrast our newspaper with another newspaper as well. Stacy, I see your hand up. Do you want to unmute?
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I wanted to point out, you've been dancing around this topic of unitary status, but that is in the publication, very briefly anyway, I believe. And the notion is that there was a federal judge by the name of Elizabeth Kovacevic who really made a lot of the decisions concerning the necessity to bus children in this region. And the school district had to demonstrate to Judge Kovacevic that they had made a good faith attempt to integrate their schools and had actually achieved some measure of integration. And that was an attempt to declare the school had achieved the district unitary status. And once that decision was made in the 90s, that ended a lot of the busing in this district, in this region.
Thank you. Somebody asked a question about if our sources are K-12 or post-secondary, and they're both. If you are a college teacher, we are happy to share. We are happy to share resources with you as well.
Hi, excuse me, this is Stacy. My toolbar disappeared, but just made another appearance. I believe that my questions are not understood correctly. I was asking, and I believe one of your colleagues addressed this, but to be clear, I was asking if among the resources, there are student newspaper articles, student newspaper photographs, not current day students from the time and place of the events being reported. So in other words, that different audience contributing to the resources that are included. And that was whether they were K-12 or post-secondary students at the time. Does that make better sense?
I think so, yes. In the publication, we have some photos from the people that I interviewed, but most of the photos are not from their time period because most of them had like yearbooks and stuff. They didn't actually have photos of themselves. So a lot of the pictures are of them as adults, and but the information that I got from them was when they were in, I think everybody was in high school or middle school.
I understand. Thank you. I somehow, I feel like my question is still not getting through. It's all right. I understand everything you said and it is helpful. So I understand the resources are from public newspapers that could have been delivered to my driveway, mailbox, what have you, at the time. My question is not whether anyone interviewed had pictures, but if any of the newspapers you included.
Or school newspapers?
Instead of, correct, thank you.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. No, unfortunately, they're not, and that would be awesome if they were, but we did not have that, and I'm not sure who holds those archives either. I'm not sure where you would get them. That would be a great thing to include though, if we had it.
Start with the library. Your
The
local
library might have
library.
school, yeah, the local libraries. So for example, if you were in Hillsborough County, you might check with the Hillsborough County Library. They might have school newspapers from back then. But I don't know, I don't know how much students would have been encouraged to write about things that were happening in front of them like that. But that's it.
I understand. Thank you. And I appreciate the time you're dedicating to this part of the conversation. I am aware of how to go about finding such things. I thought it was a simple question as to the different authors of the primary sources in your packet. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. And somebody asked, are there local, state, and federal legislation among the resources? We do have some in the teacher guide. We have some links to the primary sources at the federal level. I think it's more at the federal and state level than the local level. And I see Sue has put all these great resources in the chat for you. She put a direct link to the publication, the additional interviews, and the pre-post test, which she would like me to encourage you all to have your students do. Right, Sue?
The pre-post test is something that we just we created if you'd like to use it in your classroom. We understand that you probably don't want to share that with us, but if you can share them with us anonymously, that's always tremendous. It helps us evaluate if what we're doing right and what we are not. I'm going to drop one more link, and that is the link to our statewide organization, Florida Press Educational Services. FPES is a group of all the newspaper and education programs from around Florida. And so this might be a simpler website to go to if you are not in the Tampa Bay area. But you are also welcome to come to the Tampa Bay Times NIE site and use our resources. We do not segregate geographically, but if you're just looking for a simpler site and just to get the publication resources, you can download them. It's the same resources, but you can download them from either place.
Thank you.
And if anyone else has questions, we have about 5 more minutes left, but I do want to put in just a little quick plug. As part of our overall Brown v. Board of Education project, in addition to these educational resources, we're also holding 4 events across the state. We have already held an event in Miami that happened. It was very successful. Next week, we're having an event in Jacksonville, if anyone's in Duval County, that will involve a screening of a documentary and then a panel discussion with local community members. On April 23rd, we'll be having an event here in Tampa Bay, in St. Petersburg, and we'll be having a panel discussion with, again, local community leaders, moderated by our very own Tammy. And then on May 6th, we'll be having an event in Tallahassee. Anyone who would like additional details about any of those, email Jody, and we will send you links to the registration pages. There is no charge to attend any of these events. And they promise to be absolutely fascinating explorations and community conversations.
Thank you very much, Sue. Denise, did you have a question?
Yes. Given that to integrate your southern schools, you bused all these students back and forth to different locations. would you say those 30 some odd years of busing was successful
Wow,
in
that's a really good question.
accomplishing the purpose and still providing quality education to these students?
What do you guys think?
Well, I mean, I think that the video you showed, one of the presenters compiled a long list of meta-analysis of studies, which I think is basically still supported, and that is integrating schools generally improves the academic achievement of all students. And just look at our society. You have to understand that we are more diverse than ever before, and this diversity is increasing. Right now, the largest minority group in the United States are Latinos or Hispanics. But the second largest minority group in the United States are Asian Americans. And those two groups are increasing in size. The white population growth rate is only about 1%, and that is barely replacement. And so I think it's essential for teachers to understand the importance of valuing diversity and helping students learn to live in a society that is very diverse, because they're going to have to interact. And that's the same thing that our adults need to learn how to do, interact with different people from different political, ideological, and ethnic backgrounds. And you know, I try to teach my students that there's only one race, Homo sapiens, thinking men and women, and that when it comes down to it, we are all more alike than unalike. And if we could only get that message across, I think we'd be a far better collaborative society.
Thank you.
And I agree in diversity because I came from a diverse community, diverse school system in both New York City and in suburbia. In fact, we only had one high school. So everybody in the town went to the one high school, no matter what their race was. And our town was very ethnically diverse. By the time I went second half of middle school and high school. Oops, my cat wants to say hello. And so I agree with that statement. But I think the trauma of busing is really hard on kids. And although I've never had to deal with that in my school days, which encompasses Brown versus Board of Ed, because I was born in the 60s, went to school in the 60s and the 70s. So, you know, I would have been around for the time when they were instituting that had I been in a segregated school system. I wasn't. And we went district, and our district in New York City included more than just my neighborhood. So we had plenty of Hispanics, or back then we called them Latinos, Puerto Ricans. We had plenty of blacks, and we had plenty of whites of different European backgrounds. Believe me, not even the Europeans got along with each other. So, as exemplified by the different gangs we had. So once I moved to the suburbs, and you had Asians and from India and Asia and people from around the world, including Muslims, you know, even before the whole Muslim issue came up, you all went to school with them because they all ended up in the same school. And it was not a big deal in terms of just integrating with people from different backgrounds. So I agree with the diversity, but I really believe children should be able to go to a neighborhood school, and that I think neighborhoods should be desegregated, because even though redlining is outlawed, we all know that somewhere along the line, they're going to impose racial restrictions in neighborhoods that are nicer. In my community where I grew up in my later, teen years, I had a friend who, when he was looking for a house, they were black, coming from the city, but he had me, he's upper middle class. And they wanted a better school system for their children, a better neighborhood. And he said to the real estate agent, I don't want any crosses burning on my lawn. Now, this is New York, mind you, where you don't generally have crosses burning on the lawn. And she said to him, money knows no color. And they moved into a community that was upper middle class, that was inhabited by doctors and lawyers and so forth, and they were welcomed with open arms. And the neighbor across the street, who was Jewish, said, we have a tree house in our yard, our children are grown, your sons can play in the tree house. Black and white across the street from each other. There were Indians in that neighborhood, other Asians, because that area had doctors and lawyers of different ethnic backgrounds, and it wasn't an issue.
And one of the people that I talked to gave me that same information, that the community that they lived in was normally integrated. So it wasn't a big deal when they integrated the schools, because the schools were naturally integrated and they didn't have to worry about busing. So that's very interesting.
One of the activities
being a problem.
One of the activities in the teacher guide, I think will also be eye-opening to many students, because it includes a mention of Boston. I think there are a lot of people who think that this was solely a Southern problem, and although it was largely a Southern problem, it wasn't. And Boston, Massachusetts had a lot of violence related to integration in the schools, and I think that would be an interesting aspect to explore with students.
I'm glad you brought that up, because Boston and Dr. King had more problems in Chicago than he had in the South, and he did have a great many problems in Florida too, as well. But I would say that Boston is an interesting example, and something that can be used to kick off a discussion among the students. That is, why was there so much resistance, even in the North, to integrating schools? And I mean, and today, as I said earlier, there is more segregation in schools today than prior to the Brown decision. But you hit on some of those things there. The declaring areas having unitary status, neighborhood housing segregation. These kinds of things lead to increased segregation in the schools. It's sort of a voluntary kind of thing, but I think Denise asked an important question: are there benefits to integrating schools? And the answer is yes. And the answer, even more stridently than that, our future is based on integration. We're not going to live in little discrete hamlets and then be at war with one another. We've seen that in our history. We don't want to relive the past. We have to move into the future, and the future is a diverse future.
And that is a good point. So I just want to thank everyone for spending the evening with us. You guys have been a great audience, and you have asked some great questions. I will follow up with an email sending you a link to the survey and a link to the materials, and reminding you again that if you'd like to get newspaper access for your classroom, we are here to help you. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a wonderful rest of the evening and a great rest of the week.
Okay, thank you.